Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of August. Today we have some important updates beginning with the Vodiane front, then moving northwards to Pokrovsk and Toretsk, of course also New York, and finishing off with some developments occurring right now around the Kursk offensive. And so we're going to zoom in and look at, once again, updates from Pokrovsk. Every day now we're receiving frontline updates, and they are occurring generally along the same axes. As you can see, that the Russian momentum has not dissipated. And we're going to then get into some questions surrounding the 47th Mechanized Brigade. But as we zoom in, you'll see in yellow the gains that the Russians accrued over the past 24 hours. You can see basically they're just solidifying control over the flanks of Zhevetne and Novozelane because they were able to enter into those villages relatively quickly, and they really did not have a lot of pushback in those attempts. Of course, they were targeted with artillery and with drones from above, but in terms of actual engagements on the ground, it occurred relatively quickly, and so the Ukrainians rather swiftly were able to withdraw into areas like Ptyche. And right now, there are already reports coming out of a Ukrainian withdrawal from Komishivka over here, but it's not verified yet. But just based on the sort of shape that is forming with the envelopment that you guys see on the map pretty clearly, it is likely that the Ukrainians are being squeezed out of here. And that also includes the nearby strong points that you see marked with these red lines. And so just to go back to the advance from today, this sort of gives the Russians more of this sort of like connecting corridor between the two clusters of villages that took over. Of course, at the east they advanced, but also in Mykolaiivka, they were able to conduct a really deep advance by just continually pushing through the windbreaks along the rail line from Hryhorivka all the way to Mykolaiivka, breaking the Ukrainian line in an area where it was definitely not expected. And you could see how the defenses were built in a way that didn't take into account that the Russian forces would even be able to frontally assault Mykolaiivka from the rail line. And now you see that the Russians have been able to fully solidify control over this general region and have turned it into a forward operating base to continue advancing southwards. And you can see based on the advances that the Russians are already taking over territory along the Vavcha River, even crossing south of it, which is important, establishing a bridgehead, taking over tree lines, local roads. And you could see now how this is all being formulated with the hope of then advancing further southwards. And we've talked about this already, but just continually advancing towards these fields, including on a hill. And all these arrows that are pointing southwards, they are pointing towards a high elevated area that is overlooking basically all of the Ukrainian settlements in the region, whether it be Mikhailivka, Mimrik, Kalinove, Ptyche, of course the E50 highway overlooking that, which the Ukrainians are still using as a sort of conduit to reach the front line around Kharlivka. Kharlivka is very important for them. They really are trying to maintain control over the last vestiges of their Vavcha River bridgehead near this reservoir crossing. And now there are already some reports claiming that the Russians have been able to clear out this piece of space in between Hryhorivka and the reservoirs. But I can't say that for certain, so I haven't actually changed the map. But it would just seem logical based on previous movements that the Russians are now looking to close in on this particular region as they continue their advances southwards towards the village of Kalinove. And then, of course, also as a means by which to overlook much of the river valley on which Selidove is located. Now, as we're talking, it's not just a southern direction in which they're advancing, it's also in the western direction. So Russian squads, as you can see, based on this marking here, were able to accrue 1.2 square kilometers, again, mainly pushing through these dense windbreaks. And as you guys may know, Deep State reported during the Russian breakthrough around the Vavcha River when they were advancing towards Pokrovsk, for instance, the sort of extent of the Russian squads that were advancing together, you can't even call them squads because they were larger than that. You could say they're 2 or 3 times larger than what you'd imagine a squad to be, reaching like 20 men or even more advancing in the same formation. And so I'm not sure if that's occurring now because of how deep the salient has gone and because the Russians are approaching areas where the villages are not even villages anymore, they're towns. They're rather large and have various quarries that are overlooking them and slag heaps. So I'm not sure if the same extent of troops are being sent in at the same time, but definitely the Russians have the ability to. And when Deep State reported on these initial sort of Russian exploitations and the Russians being able to utilize larger amounts of manpower in the same region, that was about a month ago. And that's at a time when the Ukrainian garrison here did not have to ration shells. They had plenty of 155 millimeter shells, for instance, a vast array of different types, whether it be for closer range mortars, which the Ukrainians like using. And of course, they have their drones and their various really well formulated drone companies like the Strike Drone Company of the 47th Brigade. And so they had a vast assortment of firepower. And even then, there were issues with always utilizing artillery to target those large squads, which would, of course, be the most preferable because of the sort of blast radius that it causes. But then they had to really relegate a lot of the tasks to actual drones, which, again, you could pick off troops one by one in a way that is more accurate, but then doing it at scale and taking out all of the 20 is more difficult. So now, as you may know, there is already reporting that the Ukrainians in this direction are beginning to ration shells once again. The last time they had to do this really in a serious manner was in Avdiivka, and that again played a big role in why the Russians were able to infiltrate through various gaps in the Ukrainian line and create a lot of sort of exploitations along flanks that squeezed out the Ukrainians from Avdiivka in a way which prevented the Russians from suffering many more casualties. And you could see something very similar occur now, where perhaps if there was a Russian squad advancing through here, they would have previously been spotted by the reconnaissance, which is something that I'm sure still is occurring because you have very dense Ukrainian drone presence here. But then it can't always be sort of actualized and turned into a successful strike if they're rationing the shells in a way that's very frugal. And so now, for measuring the distance of the Russian advance, it amounts to nearly 2 kilometers, and they really are approaching the actual entrance at this point. And Hryhorivka is a rather important village, as we talk about. Not only would taking it really give the Russians a vector to essentially have full control over the northern flank of Selidove, whether it be the supply line, which would at that point be superfluous, or also the heights, this really massive height that's overlooking Selidove. Taking over Hryhorivka would give the Russians a forward operating base that at some point, not anytime soon, I don't think, but sometime in the midterm, you could say, would eventually turn into a Russian forward artillery base. Because you do have some high elevated areas, not necessarily in Hryhorivka, but either to the east or to the west. And this appears to be an area where you also have a lot of dense tree lines, and it is also a rather well-built town that is connected to various roads and the rail line itself. And so it seems like a reasonable area to store a large concentration of shells and artillery, in the same way that now we're seeing Orlivka, which is way further to the east. But if you recall, the Russians took it over. They utilized that as an artillery hub, and even larger to an even larger extent, Ocheratina over here used as a hub for like D-30s. Probably other systems have been moved in that are even longer range at this point. The same thing could happen to some of these elements that the Russians are now looking towards getting, and the goal would be to utilize the heights to overlook certain portions of the trenches that the Ukrainians built in yellow, certain parts of the supply lines leading into Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk, and then the sort of silver lining for the Ukrainians is that at least Pokrovsk isn't on low elevation, so there would be a bit of parity even if the Russians were able to advance along this southern axis, which is what could happen if Hryhorivka falls. At that point, you'd have the Russians continually advancing along this rail line, which would threaten, of course, these other villages that are located to the northeast, like Mykolaiivka and, of course, Hryhorivka, but then also ones to the west and, most importantly, to the north, leading directly into an area like Pokrovsk. So recently, a lot of rumors have begun to surface, some of it coming from Russian sources, and then more broad language coming from specifically Ukrainian sources, not military sources, but Ukrainian political sources, about movement of some troops away from their forward trenches in this part of the front line in the Pokrovsk direction and abandoning those trenches, leaving them open for Russians because of some sort of troop diversion to the Kursk front. And that's something that has not been verified yet at any large scale, that there is some sort of organization of a second echelon of Ukrainian brigades to be sent into Kursk. And it's something that you have to really take with a lot of skepticism because you don't have proof for that. But what I will say is that I'm trying to look for recent footage from the 47th Brigade, and the footage that I'm seeing is particularly from the Strike Drone Company, which is one company that, of course, can act detached on its own. It could be attached to other units. That always happens with Ukrainian drone elements. They don't have to be attached to the actual brigade. And so just looking at the 25th Battalion of the brigade, for instance, which has been very active around here, around Jelana, as recently as 2 weeks ago, I don't know if they're still here. We have to wait for proof. And then the Russian sources, they actually talked about striking a command hub of the 47th Brigade within Sumy region itself. And so again, this is something that the Russian MOD claimed, and there's no proof of it, but they show, I think it was 3 FABs launched into the city of Hlukiv, which is in like northern Sumy. I'll actually show it to you guys because they released footage of it, grainy footage, but they attached 47th Brigade, and that just sort of piqued my interest. And so I'm just throwing it out there so you guys are aware. But yeah, speaking of units, we actually have a video from the 25th Air Assault Brigade, which is a unit that I always knew was operating around Pokrovsk, but in recent weeks we haven't seen much from them. Now we know that they've been redirected to specifically defend around Hryhorivka. So I have this video from Hryhorivka, which the Russians took over recently, and it shows just various drones dropping grenades onto Russian squads, 5, 6 plus, advancing through this diagonal road, through the houses, through the backyards. And so again, now we know that this element is engaged in supporting the National Guard in the 151st Brigade in their defense here. Now looking southwards towards Vodiane front, as I'm now going to refer to it, of course you could also call it Kostyantynivka front. We have this one piece of footage which is from the 72nd Brigade, their Bulava units. So they conducted FPV strikes which destroyed or damaged 8 armored vehicles. And again, you're just continuing to see that the Russian columns here, they have not stopped. There are periods where there are extreme lulls, but then also extreme attacks, extreme pushes through very concentrated routes. And that's something that is good for Ukrainian defenders and their drone crews. So for instance, this advance occurred largely around this route or perhaps through here. And so those vehicles were of course spotted and picked off by specifically the FPVs. But then afterwards, you saw that the troops have to get out. They're not all killed, of course. And so the ones that are able to get out before any sort of explosion internally, they are spotted by the drone crew, and it's the task of the operators to drop grenades onto them as they're hiding under vehicles or as they're running into tree lines. And so that's a lot of what the 72nd Brigade shows in this video. So that's how you know that there are casualties yielded in these vehicular assaults. So you can see now that the Russians have been able to infiltrate the 0532 highway leading from Kostyantynivka to Vuhledar in 2 points, and they really are trying to solidify control over the rest of the fields east of it before making a massive move into Vodiane, for instance. That's the sort of immediate goal afterwards. But then they're also now opening new vectors through which to attack Kostyantynivka. So we already know about this update. This is a bit old, I think, this sort of advance into the eastern parts of the village. And so recently, this past week or 2 weeks, finally you've had Russian forces able to actually reach these houses and create a permanent settlement. And now you're seeing that the Russians are also advancing from Pokrovsk, which they took over. And that's being used along with as paved roads as a sort of vector for armored vehicles. And so here we have the 79th Brigade repelling a Russian column northeast of Kostyantynivka. The footage is shown. The 79th, their drone reconnaissance drones, they spotted the column, they destroyed the first vehicle, and that caused the rest of them to sort of break off and dismount. And that's when, of course, the troops are spotted out in the open in this region over here with the X. And then it becomes a field day for the drone operators that drop grenades onto them. So that occurred over here, but it also shows that the Russians have advanced, if we're measuring it, let's see, about 1.3 kilometers, and they're trying to actually get control over these dachas north of the Suchy Yali River to finally create an immediate northern flank to finally squeeze out these Ukrainian forces that have been able to mount a really extended operation to hold on to this village. And doing so from the northern flank would be very important, taking over those trenches and also finally getting the Ukrainians out of this sort of pocket over here north of Pokrovsk. This is an area the Ukrainians are really entrenched in, and there's strong defense by the from the 46th actually Air Mobile Brigade that has been able to repel Russian assaults, whether they're from the east or from the north, to finally squeeze out the Ukrainians from this particular pocket. Looking very briefly at Zaporozhye, I don't want to focus on this because I really would wait for more sources, but I just do want to mention that channels such as Romanov, and I really wouldn't take what they're saying at face value if they're the only one reporting on it. But they're talking about the potential for a Ukrainian attack, probably in small groups, occurring in the Polohi direction. That's what they're referring to it as. So not in the Orkiv region to the west, but somewhere around Polohi, this city over here, this massive Russian logistical hub that is surrounded by 2 layers of just massive Russian trenches. It's a really well fortified area. And then you have this massive buffer zone, security zone, as the Russians call it, which measures around 10 kilometers northwards. And it's an area that's rather open, but also has some defenses in between that can't be seen via satellite imagery. And so I have this video here. I just wanted to show you the geolocation. It's a video from August 20th of the 98th Separate Battalion, and they just conducted shelling and drone drops onto the hedgerows here and onto, various Russian positions in Luhivske. And so this confirms the Russians were actually in this village. And then it's just one of the only recent pieces of video evidence that I've seen from this particular direction, because we really do see a drought in terms of the extent of the Ukrainian density in troops here. Same thing with the Russians to a certain extent. And then also in terms of the videos being released by the Ukrainians from here. And so just keep it in the back of your mind. But I really would stress that you can't really take all the information about impending offensives at face value just because in Kursk there was one. Just looking at it from a rational perspective, conducting two sort of offensives in the same time when you're also being forced to redirect certain forces from the east, from Toretsk, for instance. We're going to get to that in a second. And then potentially even from Pokrovsk, even after the first echelon was peeled off. That would cause a lot of discontent with the brigade commanders here and just the troops on the ground that are involved in the grinding fighting and are seeing that a lot of the priority is being moved away from them after really throughout the entire summer we're getting a lot of attention due to the American aid package. But now to recalibrate and look at New York, Deep State, they're claiming something rather interesting, that there were two Russian vectors, as we talked about previously, one coming from the west, one from the east, of course, and that there's actually a Ukrainian presence remaining within the northern parts of New York, which includes this factory region and a lot of the residential areas. And so Deep State, they concocted this really weird shape where they're leaving inside sort of like a donut shape. The inside of the donuts is still not cleared by the Russians, and they're claiming that the Russians simply bypassed the Ukrainians still entrenched over there and are trying to just create a large garrison in Hryhorivka with the hope that that then makes it impossible for the Ukrainians to break out, and that there's now Ukrainian drone crews trying to strike those Russian groupings operating within Hryhorivka. Now, obviously, I can't confirm that, but just based on the sort of shape that they're making, it just isn't something that would appear to be natural. And so I'm really, really yearning for videos to come out to fully clarify the situation here. But for now, I'm just going to keep it the same as it was in yesterday's updates, where Deep State actually claimed that the Russians were able to get control over the entirety of the factory region following combing operations. Then further northwards, we're getting additional proof of Russian presence within most of Pivnishnya. So the Russians were able to solidify control over this region here, and then this area in eastern Pivnishnya amounting to, let's see, 47 hectares. And then looking a bit to the north, we have this region east of the canal, which is on a sort of rather high elevation, local hill or local uphill region. And it's an area that is also littered with dense tree lines and defenses. And it's an area that the Ukrainians were able to hold on to for a really long time because there was no Russian pressure going on in this region. And it may be under the theater of the 28th Brigade, which is generally operating near Kostyantynivka. And so now it just appears that the Ukrainians had to withdraw from here, with the Russians finally solidifying control over their flanks in an effort to then push towards the rest of Druzhba, both from the northeast, as we're seeing, but also from Pivnishnya, as the Russians continue to clear out the remaining gray zone in that region. And having a solid foundation in Pivnishnya would mean that this mine over here is in serious danger. I think it's called the Novo mine. And so that will give the Russians a localized vantage point to overlook much of the forested region leading into Toretsk, and even the center of Toretsk itself, looking into the highway that is basically bisecting through Toretsk. And then also the Russians would have a forward base for their troops to actually then go in and begin attacks towards the city itself. Now, when it comes to actual soldiers and units here, 78th Hertz Regiment, that's one of the OG units that was defending over here. They had a presence here throughout the entirety of the summer and were just sort of sent in to hold the line because no other troops were there to reinforce them. But we haven't really heard much of them since the Russians actually launched their operation in late June. And so I don't know if they're actually defending here. Maybe perhaps they're split, because now we're receiving information that the Hertz Regiment has been moved to the Kursk region to engage with the offensive over there. And it would just be logical because this regiment is a part of Ukraine's Air Force, or their Air Assault Forces, sorry. And so there's various other battalions of air assault units like the 95th that are partially operating over there. They have battalion tactical groupings that are working together. And so it wouldn't be too far-fetched if that was the case. Looking at Chasiv Yar, there are once again reports circulating of the Russians actually being able to cross back over the canal, reaching into some of the residential areas in the Oktyabrski district. I think that's what it's called from memory. And this is something that originally the Ukrainians claimed that during the launching of the Kursk offensive, they were able to repel all of the Russian foothold across the canal. And so now the Russians are beginning to finally rebuff those claims and say that they've been able to take back some of those residential areas. But I'll wait for a confirmation from large Ukrainian sources or from geolocated footage before I change the map. An area where we do know the Russians are advancing is just southeast of Hryhorivka. This is a really massive, high elevated area in X, just to the northwest of Bodanivka. And the Russians have been able to systematically just destroy the Ukrainian positions in trenches here, and then one by one clear out the various plots of fields and tree lines here. And you don't have a significant Ukrainian presence here anymore. Neither is there in Hryhorivka, and it's a rather small hamlet at this point. And so the Russians are positioned in a way that is really advantageous for a frontal assault towards here. And the goal is, of course, to clear out the remaining Ukrainian positions east of the canal. And the canal itself spans all the way northwards to the Donetsk River, but I'm specifically talking about areas like Orekhovo, Vasilivka, and Kivka, for instance, where there are still some Ukrainian nodes that have not really been touched. And they're actually on the road to Slovyansk and even branches out to Kramatorsk when you're looking into the very, very deep future. And so the Russians would, of course, want to make preparations for just setting the battlefield in a way that would be conducive for advancing near those highways. But more locally, advancing on the northern flank would provide the Russians with a really good option to create forward operating bases that are actually flanking Chasiv Yar from an area that has similar elevation and could actually prevent the Russians from having to fight from house to house, directly advancing from the east. And so that's something the Russians are looking at doing from the north, not a really serious attempt so far, and then also perhaps from the south, given the recent pushes around Klishivka. But it will require a lot more work from the 98th VDV division, which has certain elements of it, certain battalions of brigades in that division that have been rediverted towards the fighting in Kursk. And so the intensity of the Russian assaults definitely has decreased during that time period. Now moving on to the situation in Kursk Oblast, let's zoom in and see some of the videos released recently. Here's a video east of Alexandrovka. It is from August 21st. It shows a really significant Russian shelling of a forested area west of the village. And the only piece of Ukrainian equipment is just briefly, you could see the top of a Ukrainian vehicle, I believe. And that's about it. But you could see very intense Russian shelling. So clearly their reconnaissance spotted the Ukrainian presence here. And again, the fact that the Ukrainians are operating here shows that they've been able to bypass through one way or another the Russian positions located near Durovka, Vitreno, Olgovka. And the way that seems most likely to me is through this axis just to the west, because this is an area, this region, which I'll measure for you guys, spans about 10 kilometers. It's a region where we don't have enough information about the density of Russian forces. We know there's a presence near Safonovka, very, very far to the north, like 15 kilometers to the north. But then all the areas in between the front line to over here, Kramanoy, there's been no confirmation of a Russian presence here up until like August 12th. And that's really a long time ago. And so there may have been changes during that period of time. Maybe a sustained Ukrainian pressure campaign forced the Russian reinforcements out of this region. It could be in the gray zone. But the fact that all the surrounding regions are really avenues through which the Ukrainians could advance would indicate to me that at the very least all the fields here in the forested regions are a gray zone, and that it's a route through which the Ukrainians can advance and reach all the way and bypass the front line to the west over here, where you do have Russian reinforcements fighting tooth and nail, and reach an area like this trade station and reach near Alexandrovka. Of course, we don't have proof that they've actually been present in the village, but we know now that there are still mobile squads even 2 weeks into the operation. We're going in rather deep. In this case, if we're measuring the sort of minimum depth, then it was around 7 kilometers. But in more realistic terms, it's closer to like 15 kilometers in. And while we're on the topic of reinforcements, if we were to zoom in here, there's another video from Olgovka, once again showing a Ukrainian presence nearby. You could see a Ukrainian VAB, so this is a French APC, and it was destroyed near Olgovka. It was filmed by the Russian side, of course, and what they showed here is it looked like it exploded internally, but regardless, the vehicle just was destroyed and then targeted with drone drops, and this is just outside of Olgovka itself. And so you can see there are definitely Ukrainian mobile squads operating here while the Russian forces are fighting near the Reka Krepna River. This video here was recorded from the Reconnaissance and Strike Company of the 155th Marine Brigade. Now it's important to note this unit previously we noted its operations in Novomikhailivka played a central role in actually taking over that village, then had some sort of presence, at least one battalion, in the Vovchansk region during the offensive. Recently, has also been involved in defending around Kolytoivka, and so that's how we knew of their presence within the border near Kursk and Belgorod Oblast. And now it appears that certain elements have also been moved further northwestwards to be involved in the defending near Karnovo. And in regards to other Marine brigades like the 810th, we actually know that at least 3 battalions of that particular unit are operating now within this part of the front line in Kursk. We know that the 1st, 5th, and 382nd battalions are operating, and they're all from the 810th Brigade, as I said before. There may be another one that I'm missing out on, but based on what I've seen, there are 3, and it's from geolocations and POW videos. So once again, just to zoom in, east of Koranovo, the Russians have been able to contain the Ukrainian mobile groups largely in the sense that they can operate and move deep along roads and fields to the east. But once they enter into the actual populated areas, that's when the Russians begin to utilize a vast array of firepower in a means by which the Ukrainians cannot actually hold on to any sort of foothold within the village itself. But further southwards, they have been able to send in DRGs rather deep into this forested region. So much so that there are actually fires reported in Krasnutiaborsk, and that's probably due to combat-related fires because there are actually clashes within the hamlets as the Russian forces are really at a disadvantageous position because the Ukrainians are coming in from these dense forests. It's hard to spot them, and the Russians, of course, they are surrounded by rivers and just low-lying river valley all around them. And of course, you have the pressure from Vishnevka. And so the Ukrainians, even as reported by Rybar, for instance, they have launched a really serious attempt to actually capture this village and finally sever the connection between Koranovo and the rest of the southern Seym embankment, now you could call it. And so we know another video has been released from Vishnevka. This is from the, 155th Brigade. It's a reconnaissance strike company striking Ukrainian vehicles in Vishnevka. Looking southwards at Apanasovka. Over here, we actually had as early as August 18th reports from the 501st Battalion of the 36th Ukrainian Marine Brigade, and they claimed that they took over the village. They even released a video of the flag raising and was probably from here, but that of course could be something that's transient. It doesn't mean they control it. And 3 days later, there's now once again murmurs that the village has been captured even from Russian sources. So I would just mark it as a gray zone for now, given the sort of pressure that's coming in from the south, from Venezhapnoye and from Snagost. It's very likely that that pressure is enough to squeeze out the Russians, and that there isn't even a large density of Russians here anymore, as most of their forces that are south of the Seym River are located in major population centers like Zvanoy and Glushkovo. There's probably very little along the border, some maybe in Tedkino, but then besides that, these villages here are largely uninhabited at this point, especially after the civilians were evacuated. And it's important to note that the 501st Brigade, or Battalion, is now operating here because the 36th Marine Brigade operated for a very long time in Krinky along with 3 other Marine Brigades, and now certain elements of those units have been moved away from Kherson, first towards Vovchansk to defend there, and now some elements once again moved to engage in the offensive here. And so that would allow the Ukrainians to sort of take away from a pool of manpower that isn't actually involved in fighting in Donbass. And so from a Ukrainian perspective, it would seem more reasonable to take away forces that were operating in an area like Kherson for a while where it's really not needed and send them to here. And we already know, for instance, that the 2nd Battalion of the 36th Brigade is operating in generally the Hryhorivka region. So just keep an eye out for them over here a bit to the east. And then finally, looking at the bridges, we know of 2 pontoon bridges, of course, and the Ukrainians have released really extensive recordings from their special operations forces of first FPV strikes onto numerous trucks, logistical trucks, but also engineering equipment that was set up, this sort of field equipment that was in these bases near the actual river and near the pontoons. So they were largely destroyed, and there was even one truck that fell into the river as it was driving. And so you could see the strikes on one of the bridges, the one that is located east of Zvanoy. It was hit by the M30A0 GMLRS rockets, and they of course have, there's our cluster munition rockets, the warheads, and they have around 404 bomblets in this case. Some others have like 200 or even less, depending on the type. But this one has 404. And it appears that actually the United States only has around 1,000 of these rockets that are serviceable as of 2019. So since then, with the production boom, maybe there are more within the American stockpile. But that is a really small amount. And as of last year, that's when the Americans began sending the M30s to the Ukrainians. And that was around late last year, if you recall. And I believe that the reason why America feels so comfortable about moving them in now is because they've replaced a large amount of their sort of cluster munition, long range like ATACMS stockpile, perhaps even taking from some South Korean stockpiles in order to reinforce what they already have and compensate for whatever they lost by sending some of them to Ukraine. So based on satellite imagery, actually, the original location of the bridge was here, but then it was moved away and set up once again here. So the Russians do continue to have this route, but just know that the Ukrainians are only like 13 kilometers away from here. So it's within the range of artillery, especially this long-range artillery is being utilized, raining in on it like ATACMS. And of course, FPV drones are a constant threat for whatever troops are located in this area. And then zooming in on Glushkovo here, the bridge was targeted by 3 M31 from the GMLRS, and so these were all launched from M270s. And as you can see during the video, which is linked over here, there was a sort of dispersion, and that's due to sort of attempts by the Russians to conduct jamming. But despite that fact, the Russians were unable to prevent the pontoon from being struck, and so there was still in the river region a lot of sort of scattering, but still the pontoon itself was hit. Additionally, I would note that based on satellite imagery, it appears that one span of the Karish bridge is still functional. So although there is significant damage to one side, the other one could actually still be used at the very least by troops that are operating on foot. So that's important to note. Just a general theme is that the Ukrainians have also been able to strike in this part of the front line. Of course, a lot of those field equipment, engineering, an anti-air missile complex, 152 millimeter D-20 was destroyed. It was recorded on camera in the same compilation. So the Ukrainians really are now not as focused with the ground advances in this region, although there are some like in Anna Pasovka, but a lot of preparation with these strikes. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.